Happy Thanksgiving, and although the Pilgrims were not the first English settlers in North America, I thought it would be an interesting way to recognize the holiday by making a What If the English Never Settled in North America timeline. By both geography and population, Anglo-North Americans are one of the largest ethnic groups in the world, with a population of around 250 million, and ranging from Alaska and the Yukon to Florida. In summary, Anglo-Saxon North Americans have been extremely successful, and so it's an interesting timeline to have the English never colonized in the New World. What would the borders be like? What would culture be like? That is the question of this alternate history. In this timeline, Sir Walter Raleigh never exists, and so interest in North America would be far less, since he helped propagate it. Also, James and Queen Elizabeth are simply not interested and prefer to look into the Caribbean, India, or Indonesia, for fear that the Spanish would destroy any future colony. Perhaps an explorer would wander amongst the native tribes, finding no signs of gold, and the lack of gold and silver would prevent interest in colonization. Without the English, who would be the main European force in North America? If the English never arrived in America, there would be three other European powers involved in 17th century North America: the French in Quebec, the Dutch in New York, and the Spanish in New Mexico and Florida. I know I'm going to get some comments saying how the Swedes had a colony in Delaware. I'd just like to say that I'm very aware of this. However, the Swedish colonies were conquered by the Dutch without the English, and the Swedish colonies were chronically undersupplied and barely survived, as is in our timeline. Without the British, the Dutch would continue to control their colony in New York. The Dutch would spread around the mid-Atlantic, probably ranging from North Carolina to New England. However, as South Africa has proven, the Dutch would simply not have the excess population to spread from their coastal region. The Dutch were quite tolerant, and so Germans, Swedes, and Britishers would probably settle into the colony, assimilating into Dutch culture. The modern-day Cajuns are descendants from the French Acadians of what is now New Brunswick, who were evicted from the colony by the British and sailed down the east coast looking for a new home. All the 13 British colonies did not let them settle, so they founded a new home in the loose French colony of Louisiana and founded New Orleans. If the British were never involved in North America, the Acadians never would have settled in Louisiana, and the region would have remained native for much longer. However, the region is so strategic that the French probably would have settled New Orleans at some later date. Would the French Quebecois have had the same continent-crushing manifest destiny that the Americans and Anglo-Canadians had? Yes, but to a lesser extent, and for many complicated reasons. First of all, there were a lot less Quebecois. Most of the settlers in Quebec were mainly ex-soldiers and priests. This is in contrast to the mainly family nature of the British colonies. The lack of females, and simply less people, meant that the population remained extremely small. However, the amount of immigrants, and especially female immigrants, began to skyrocket right before the British conquest in our timeline, meaning that if the French kept Quebec, the population and thus expansion would have happened on some level. However, another detail handicaps French expansion: the French government. The British colonies effectively ran themselves before the Revolution, but in Quebec they had strict governors and the control by the French government was much closer. The colony was closely controlled by a class of noble landowners and the church. Things happened less by just random anarchy, like in the British colonies, but by government initiative. The French government, wanting to keep their tribal allies happy, would not have okayed complete manifest destiny continent-crushing colonization. Even after the British colonization, the Quebecois could have immigrated west into Manitoba and Ontario, but never did. This points to not having the Quebecois not having the incredible population pressures that the 13 colonies did in our timeline, or having some social inertia not to do so, and so they probably would not have colonized all of North America. The Spanish would likely take a very long time to colonize all their colonies in North America. Most history buffs live under the misconception that the Spanish colonized all of Mexico before they reached California and New Mexico. However, Santa Fe and Spanish California were small dots of settled land. Most of northern Mexico was unsettled at the point that New Mexico was conquered, and was maintained by caravans passing through unsettled land on the way to New Mexico. The Spanish would likely fill up northern Mexico before they would colonize Utah, Colorado, Texas, or the Southwest in general. Heck, in our timeline into the late 19th century, native tribes survived in northern Mexico as their own entities. Also, the Spanish Empire is simply so massive that the northern Mexico is probably the last choice for a Spaniard thinking about settling in the New World, with fertile lands in South America being a much better option. This bodes very well for the Native Americans, with the French expansion being weaker than the Anglo-Saxon, the Dutch barely existing on a continental scale, and the Spanish taking a while. This would give the Native American tribes time to recover from the European plagues that struck them. The big native tribe that probably would have dominated if the Europeans took longer to arrive would be the Iroquois. The Iroquois owned a massive empire at the start of the 18th century, stretching from the eastern border of Missouri to western Pennsylvania, and from the edge of Quebec to Kentucky. With the Europeans weaker, the Iroquois would remain being the most powerful native tribe. The British, if they did not colonize America, would have lots of pent-up population that would look for a release. This was an issue lots of European countries had at the time, and would probably not make Britain special. However, it would probably lead to more revolts in the Celtic fringe, which had the highest percentage of the population which immigrated to America. If the French never lost their domains in the New World, and the American Revolution never happened, the French Revolution would never happen. The American Revolution inspired the French Revolution. Also, without the expense of supporting the American colonies in the Revolution, France would not get into unsustainable debt. With the colonies still open, the French could export their excess population, aka the people who'd be angry enough with the system to rebel in our timeline. If the French Revolution never happened, a revolution in some other country would have happened. The issues France had were issues the rest of Europe had too. It's just that France had them worse. Without the French Revolution, there never would have been reform in other European countries to prevent another revolution like it. I've been able to loosely guess that Austria would be the first egg to crack. With Prussia being efficiently run, France being wealthy and successful, Spain and Russia being effectively medieval economically, Britain and Holland being democracies and so better able to adapt. Also, some minor German and Italian states would probably rebel with Austria. The Austrian Revolution without France's population and Napoleon would be crushed by the Prussians and the French, and the Austrian monarchy quickly restored. Without 20 years of defeats against Napoleon, Prussia would have unified Germany much earlier. This would also mean that they would get their pick of nice colonies, since they would be involved in the colonial race at an earlier date. Without the Napoleonic Wars, Spain would never be conquered by the French, so the Spanish Empire would probably survive much longer. Spain was so poor and lightly settled that it's hard to imagine them maintaining their massive colonial empire into the industrial era. However, the French being the most powerful nation on earth and allies with the Spanish would probably mean that the French would prop up the Spanish Empire into the 19th century. Without the Napoleonic Wars, the Dutch would probably maintain being an empire of some note. In our timeline, during the French occupation of the Netherlands, the British stole Ceylon, Malaysia, and South Africa from the Dutch. During the scramble for Africa, the Dutch out of South Africa would colonize Bechuanaland and Rhodesia, whilst controlling the Straits of Malacca would give them lots of trade power. However, in a balance of power war, it is possible that the French might have conquered the Netherlands with Napoleon leading them. People often forget about the five civilized tribes. In the early 19th and late 18th centuries, the southeast was inhabited by tribes that adapted very closely to European customs. The Cherokee, for example, made their own alphabet, oftentimes lived and dressed like Europeans, and interbred very closely with Europeans. Their mimicking of European customs made them more civilized in the eyes of Europeans, and hence their title. If given the time, the Cherokee would likely continue to modernize and trade with Europeans. Even without the British, the Cherokee would probably modernize. The ability that they wanted to modernize in our timeline would mean that, similarly to Japan, when they would see the French spreading in the Deep South and the Dutch in the lowlands, the Cherokee would decide to industrialize to survive. This would radically destroy the American balance of power. The old Iroquois Empire, who did not modernize as well in our timeline, would be destroyed. The Cherokee would likely team up with the French, who at this point probably would have colonized Ontario and the Huron, age-old enemies of the Iroquois, to divide up the Midwest. The Shawnee, meanwhile, being the largest and most powerful tribe under Iroquois domination, would declare independence. As technology would improve, it would render the cavalry tactics of the nomads of the Great Plains irrelevant, and so the plains would be divided amongst the French and Cherokee, with parts going to the Shawnee in the 19th century. The Spanish, being a weak rump state, would likely be happy with their domains in Texas. The Cherokee, meanwhile, would likely take the lower plains, the Shawnee part of Missouri, and the French the upper. As the 20th century would begin, there would be a massive migration from Mexico into the southwest, as Mexico would begin to fill up. The Spanish government would defeat the lightly settled tribes like the Apache and the Comanche with modern technology. In this timeline, the American southwest would be culturally Mexican. With no one in the Pacific Northwest, the Russians based out of Alaska would likely loosely claim it and in reality have no settlers there. The British, being an island, would have a strong navy, and so would still do well in the colonial race of the 19th century, carving out good colonies in Africa, Asia, and Oceania. The idea of carving up the weakening Spanish Empire and the tangle of alliances and lost hopes after the scramble for the Great Plains would create a powder keg waiting to be blasted in the First World War in the Americas. Let me give you some examples. The Cherokee being afraid of being surrounded by the French in Louisiana and in the North in the Midwest. the Comanche wanting to rebel against the Spanish and form an alliance with the Cherokee, Mexico wanting to rebel against the weakening Spanish Empire, the British wanting to sweep Cuba away from the Spanish, the Cherokee wanting to conquer Florida from the Spanish, the French wanting to conquer the Pacific Northwest and put settlers there before the Russians would put settlers there, the Dutch feeling threatened by being surrounded by the French, and so forth. However, it's over 300 years from the start of this timeline, and so I have no idea how World War I would play out, and I'll be a dick and give you a cliffhanger for a timeline I can never finish. What if Altist? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that timeline, please comment or subscribe, and please stay tuned for my next timeline. Thank you.